Hey guys, it's Kid Capes, and let's jump right into it. It's been almost 5 years and it's finally here. Shin Megami Tensei 5. This is going to be a spoiler-free review, so don't expect a lot of depth in this one. I'll do a video more about 5's themes specifically later. This sort of video is different from my channel, so just know I'll be explaining aspects of the game, like how it handles the gameplay and the writing, and afterwards, summarize my general thoughts. But before we get into it, I gotta let you guys know that I did receive a review copy from Atlas. They're pretty good people over there. I didn't really expect to get a copy, so thanks. Anyway, let's get on to the show. We can start with what's often considered the highlight of the Shin Megami Tensei series, its combat. It's largely what you'd expect from modern SMT titles. Monster capturing JRPG, 4-character parties, and turn-based combat featuring the press turn mechanic. For those new to the series, essentially, the way press turn works is if you hit a weakness, you get more turns. If you hit a resistance, you lose turns. This time around, it comes with a new twist, Magasuhi skills. They work kind of like limit breaks. You have a gauge, and over time it'll fill up, and then you can use a super special skill. Every race of demons has their own unique skill, which you can unlock by obtaining talismans from side quests. I found this to be a pretty interesting way to make demon races more unique, but at the same time, I felt some of the skills were redundant, or just totally useless, especially when compared to the universal Magasuhi skill, or Magataki critical, which makes every subsequent attack on that turn a critical hit. This mechanic also affects some of the writing to an extent, since tying races to the gameplay means balancing out the amount of races in the game, and likewise, the demons in those races. Personally, I think this might be why the Reaper race isn't present in SMT5, even though some of its mainstays like Mott or Turnabog are still around. And yeah, I get it, most people don't care about this, but I always thought that the races were like a really cool flavor thing that tied in the mythology to the gameplay, Moving on, I found SMT5 to be one of the harder mainline games, because most of this series is very broken. And I say this with love because they're so fun, but they're super easy to break. SMT has this image of being very difficult, but in my opinion, it's more like it's punishing. In the sense that you have to get a grasp for the mechanics before you can exploit them. You can't just brute force it that easily. As for me, I've played most of the series, so I'm buffing, I'm building my demons, I'm doing all that. I got it all down packed, right? But it still didn't save me all the time. There are some things new to 5 that frankly aren't that well thought out, but we'll get into that more later. A key part of this will involve constantly updating your demon roster to make sure they're all around your level by negotiating or fusing. This is especially important for SMT5 because its damage calculator seems to be heavily centered around the levels of the demons involved, meaning if one is too low leveled, they'll deal hardly any damage. This is by far the worst aspect of the combat, and it is so noticeable in the late game. There are crazy level jumps. Sometimes they'll be like 20 levels higher than you. It is ridiculous. Frankly, it befuddles me. It befuddles me that someone thought this was okay. In the game's last major area, I had to do all the side quests left in the game at that point just to get to around the same level as some of the stronger enemies. And I don't mean bosses, I mean roaming encounter enemies. Also, don't get it twisted, I did all the content prior. I'm making a review, I'm the SMT themes guy, I want to see all the dialogue, and it still took me 10 to 15 hours just to get to that point. It's silly, and there's no excuse for it. That said, it's not always a big deal, but sometimes it can be really bad. Sometimes you want to progress the plot, What if I didn't want to do side quests? I shouldn't have to do that to progress the plot. Okay, sorry for the rant. Anyway, I would advise players to keep some skills in their roster that aren't just for directly attacking your opponent. For instance, buffs. Buffs are a mainstay in SMT, but in 5, they've been nerfed, so that they only last 3 turns and only stack twice. You'll have to be regularly applying them to keep up the pressure on bosses. Also ailments, because they can be reliably used against bosses now. These changes are both great in my opinion, especially in regards to buffs, because they tend to be a press A to win button. If I had to guess, this has to do with the influence from Shigeo Komori, SMT5's director, who formerly worked on the Atlas's Etrian Odyssey series. I definitely recommend checking that series out if you're a fan of dungeon crawlers. In my opinion, gameplay-wise, it's the peak of the genre. Fair warning, it has no writing, but hey, if you like SMT5, And don't worry, we'll get to that too, but back to the combat. Honestly, besides level scaling, I find it pretty hard to say anything negative about the combat beyond a nitpick, so I'll close the combat section by explaining my favorite thing about it, the pace of the fights. I will preface this by saying, from what I can tell, this isn't a common opinion. It might have to do with the fact that I played on normal instead of hard mode, but I felt like the fights are very tight and almost like a high-speed race even. Normally in this series, the battles tend to be slow and steady or just an absolute wash in your favor, but I think SMT5 finds a nice balance between making you feel strong while at the same time, making you feel like you'll crumple if you get hit the wrong way. It's like both you and the bosses you fight are glass cannons in an all-out slugfest, and I liked it a lot. Normally, I'm not a fan of visible enemy health bars, but here, I think the game makes a very good use of them since it actually adds tension in a, oh man, I'm so close to winning right now sort of way. This feeling is even somewhat of a factor for the regular field demons as well, since they can also use Magasuhi skills. Sadly, the tension peters off around mid-late game when you get enough resources to easily deal with almost every threat besides a couple bosses. But to be fair, I feel like this is more of a facet of monster capturing games as a genre and not something to be held against SMT5, at least specifically. Now, for negotiation, this mechanic is really important because it's a key way that you gain more allies, and I found it to be way too easy. Figuring out what demons want to hear isn't hard at all. Furthermore, once you get into the actual negotiation phase, demons no longer run away with your loot. This means that if you have what they ask for, you can't lose. I think to fix this, maybe there should have been more resources to juggle, or more risks involved with talking to a demon to make it more engaging, but as it is, the negotiation is okay, but left a lot to be desired. Adding on to that, I thought it was a weird choice to give the player the ability to negotiate with every demon on the map, excluding the mini-bosses of course. In previous games, certain demons were impossible to negotiate with, depending on their alignment. That said, I'm not really against universal negotiation in a vacuum, but it comes alongside another issue. If you notice, a lot of the demons in the game are locked behind fusion, not even counting the obvious ones, like the ones you have to unlock through side quests or boss battles. That I am not a fan of, and I would have liked to see way more demons in the game just vibing out in the environment, doing the thing. As for fusion, I really just have two comments. The first is kind of hard to explain, but in this game, I felt that the fusion was very insular, in the sense that if you have a group of demons, you'll only be able to fuse a couple of results out of that group, no matter the combination. And I really hated that feeling because I'm really picky about what I fuse. I hate using ugly demons. Because of that, I spent most of the game with half my stock filled with demons that are far beyond the curve. And like I get it, it's a me thing, I could have just pushed on, but I don't like it. It sucked. Maybe they should have brought back triple fusion or something? That could have helped. It just really sucked to have all that dead weight in my party, you know? That said, the addition of the reverse compendium fusion was amazing, and probably my favorite new thing in SMT5. It is a real blessing when trying to fill your compendium, and I hope it returns in future entries. As for exploration, like SMT4 and for Apocalypse, 5 features field encounters rather than random encounters. However, unlike those games, 5 lets you see the actual models of those demons instead of pixelated messes. Not only does this look better, but it allows for some really neat visuals, with gigantic demons flying in the background, or small coves, where you can find a bunch of demons, chilling, living out their day-to-day. Sadly, you don't see much of the latter past the first area in the game. This brings me to the main issue I had with the game's exploration, or more like the map I guess, but the world feels lifeless. Now, this may sound weird considering the game has a lot of items and collectibles around the map, so it's not empty per se, but many of these areas are linear and don't have anything interesting going on, so I stopped feeling compelled to explore around halfway through the game. This is compounded with a feeling I had across the game that very little thought and care was put into where objects would be on the map. It really feels like their only focus was getting the player from point A to point B, and that everything else, especially collectibles and ley lines, were an afterthought. This was also often the case with demons on the field, which I can understand to a degree, but what really irks me is what I said earlier, with how the game just kinda stops having demons acting naturally or just interacting with the environment at all. At a certain point, it just kinda becomes routine to just keep running, because even if you don't know where everything is, you don't really have much motivation to stop. With all that said, I generally enjoyed the exploration, but there's a lot of room for improvement. In a sentence, I would say it felt vaguely fun, but simple. I liked running and sliding around mindlessly as a Nahobino, but often, I thought the movement was kind of awkward. For instance, while running, your turns are very wide, and you can't really see where you're going due to the narrow field of view. If you jump while running, you don't keep your momentum, and while you're midair, you can't field attack. The latter isn't really an issue mechanically, because Nahobino's attack hitbox reaches into the sky, but it still takes some getting used to. Especially since the field demons also have hitboxes that reach into the sky, so you can't just jump out the way. I found this to be very annoying, because I would often do this instinctually. I think SMT5 would have really benefited from having more player movement options, like a larger jump, a glide, or more field attacks. I thought the sliding was fun, but it can only be done on slopes, so you don't have much control over it. Same thing for the climbing, it being restricted to certain blocks. And speaking of exploring, onto the game's dungeons. Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect from the trailers, especially with this game being on the heels of SMT4 and 4 Apocalypse, but I thought they're alright. They feel very entry level, but passable, and they had more gimmicks than I expected. I'd even go as far as to say that in the midst of the game, they were like a breath of fresh air, since they mixed up the exploration and the visuals. The other parts of the game have a real issue of blending together, because most of what you see is sand and broken buildings. I think the biggest issue with the dungeons for me is that there aren't enough of them. Not only would this have broken up the flow of gameplay more, but it would have allowed for a broader range of difficulty within the dungeons, or even like a scaling difficulty. This could force the player to put into practice what they learned in previous dungeons and later ones in new ways. For instance, in my opinion, SMT's Transjourney does this very well. To fix this issue, instead of having abscesses, which are basically giant demon spawns, I would bring back SMT4's demon domains as fully designed mini-dungeons spread across the game. Not only could this break up the visuals and allow for more interesting settings, but it would also be an easy way to infuse more mythology into the game. Now the last comment I have on the exploration, and really the gameplay in general, is how terrible the game's minimap is. It has major issues with verticality, and by the end of the game, is almost unusable in certain areas. If that wasn't bad enough, when you first get to a new area, large portions of the map will be unreadable, because while abscesses are active, they blur a wide area of the minimap around them. Now I get that the point is to nudge players into fighting abscesses, but I think this is a very bad execution. And this might sound weird, but I think that a part of my issue with it is that because of this, it doesn't really feel like you're progressing or earning something when you defeat an abscess. It's more like you're getting back something you should have already had by default, be it a readable map or certain skills, and that's not a pleasant feeling. This is also part of why I wish they went with my idea for domains, because I think interesting settings or writing would have made for a good motivation for exploring. And now for the writing. Before I get into how I feel about the plot, I'm gonna try to give a little glimpse into the story for those who haven't played it yet, so they have some context. This will feature minor spoilers, so if you want to go in the game fresh, now is the time to skip. First, let's talk about the game's background lore, specifically its interpretation of the cycle, a theme which is present across mainline SMT, and in this game is represented by a divine throne. Any god who claims this throne gains the ability to shape the world to their whim, so of course, this means there's normally a constant ongoing struggle. However, the latest ruler, called the Creator, made a decree called the Condemnation, which deprived all the gods in the world except for himself of their knowledge, depowering them and literally demonizing them. Then, he took their knowledge and used it to create the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from the story of the Garden of Eden. So the snake comes around and convinces the humans to eat the apple, thereby consuming the knowledge. And for SMT5, this means that from now on, the old god's knowledge is now spiritually tied to the humans, and will reincarnate with them. Now with that out the way, the story starts at the end of a loop in this cycle. The Creator has died and was defeated by Lucifer, the Lord of Chaos, meaning all God's laws are null and void. However, with Lucifer's sudden disappearance, no one has claimed the throne, leaving the world directionless. This leads to an 18-year-long standstill between the forces of Chaos and the armies of Bethel, a worldwide coalition of gods that unwittingly fight in the name of the dead Creator. You, as a newborn Ahobino, a god who has regained their knowledge, are thrust into this conflict with your friends, Yuzuru Atsuta and Ichiro Dazai, when you were all sent into Da'at, the otherworldly ruins of a long-dead city. The three of you are forced to find your bearings, discover the truth of what happened almost 2 decades ago, and eventually, define the future for yourselves. So that's the gist. Let me start by saying I thought the plot, in concept, had a lot of potential. I think there's a lot of promise in having a sort of confused law coming out of a chaotic world, or even just a deep dive of what it's like in a stagnant world. With that said, the story is largely butchered by its execution. What is probably the most obvious issue is the pacing. As the game goes on, it feels like very little is happening. It tries this sort of minimalist storytelling, possibly to let the player's imagination carry the plot, but it utterly fails because there's nothing to latch onto. To me, the story largely felt like a series of tangentially related events until the climax of the fight with the forces of chaos. The plot also has a real problem with bloat. It feels like they stretched some of the story segments as far as they possibly could, which I think is a real shame, because the story got pretty interesting around 3/4 of the way through. Bethel, the coalition of gods, needed much more build-up. It's very vague how it works as an organization for most of the game, or even why it exists in the first place. If the branches would have been more involved in the early plot, and beyond that, had more in-depth motivations, the game would have been much more engaging. Personally, I would have liked more branches as well. For instance, a Native American branch would have been very welcome. I feel like Bethel's religions and their representatives were very conventional and uninteresting interpretations. None of this is helped by Atlas cutting out content and selling it as DLC. Cosmetics and grind DLC is like, whatever, but locking out actual story content is just so silly. Speaking of SMT5's DLC, one of the things that turned me off the hardest was the constant shallow references to previous games in the series. It feels like SMT5 is just always trying so hard to get the player to remember their old games, and it really broke my immersion. At a certain point, I got upset at the game, because they kept trying to play with established symbols or themes in a new context, which, to be clear, can be done well, but here, it felt like they almost didn't understand what they meant in the first place. I'm not going to go into spoilers, but a good bit of the events in the story just make no sense when you think about the series' broader themes, or even outright go against them. That would be bad enough by itself, but the game's own internal rules are pretty vague and poorly explained. Because of that, they come off as very inconsistent. For instance, I found that some of the endgame side quests totally trivialize the entire central conflict of the game, specifically the Demeter and Finn McCool side quests, but I can't get into why without spoilers. With all that said, we may as well start talking about the characters. In this regard, SMT5 has some of the worst writing in all of mainline SMT, and I'm not exaggerating. Most of the characters are cardboard, without clear motivations or development. It makes it very hard to care about what's happening in any of the game's climactic moments because the characters are all so bland. Frankly, a large portion of the cast could be entirely cut from the game and nothing would really change. This means that the cutscenes are very much so carried by their visuals, which to their credit can be stunning. However, here we come across another issue. In the way certain characters are depicted, it feels like the devs didn't care at all about the tone of their specific scenes. For some, the female characters, it tries so hard to fetishize them, even during scenes that should be deathly serious, which is actively distracting and breaks immersion. For other characters, the game goes out of its way to portray them as Disney villains, within a framework which is, in theory, supposed to be at least attempting to be unbiased. This, to be fair, is the norm for SMT, so I'm not really that bugged about it, but it's just really weird to me because to me, it seemed in other respects that they attempted to be more even-handed. But then, they do something like this, which is one of the most cartoonishly evil depictions in the series, outside of like outright genocide. As Kid Capes, Mr. Mythology Man himself, I feel like I have kind of a duty to talk about how SMT5 handles its mythological themes, but really, there isn't much positive to say. None of the mythology in this game is used in any interesting way that wasn't already established by previous games. Generally, the farthest these references go is a specific keyword, like a name or term from their source material, but almost none of the characters in the game reflect their myths in any meaningful way. The key exception to this is the Super Boss, which honestly makes him one of my favorite characters in the entire game. And for some characters, I get it. Like for example Abdiel, she's basically an OC from Paradise Lost, so there isn't really much to work with, but most of the demons in the main cast got done very dirty. Let's take Nua. She doesn't talk about her mythology at all, besides a vague gesture at being a mother goddess, which, if you've watched my video, Strange Journey, A Mother's Love, you would know that's a bogus archetype. There's not even a mention of China, which is really weird on its own, but frankly, is also kinda suspicious to me, knowing Atlas's and even Sega's history of depicting foreigners, and Chinese people specifically. This isn't exclusive to the writing either. You can really tell when you look at many of the new designs that trying to depict the source material was a secondary concern to aiming for mass appeal. This is most clear when looking at Aitzvarus, or just any of the female demons really. Masayuki Doi himself, the game's character and demon designer, talks about having design quotas in his commentary notes for Mananangul, saying, "The newer demons that appear in the game were all selected to fill a genre or role. Amanozaku fulfills that of a young girl, Finn McCool the role of the heartthrob, and Hayataro the beast." I'm not gonna go on a whole rant about how bad Doi is, but I'm just saying, this is not something you'd see in past interviews. Granted, I don't think the issue is just Doi. I think it's that whatever exec at the top just doesn't really care, and because of that, there's not any real quality control for the writing or the designs. This issue is also relegated to the Demon Compendium, which I have a real issue with. It's one thing to have your characters be inaccurate to the myths, because on some level, everyone understands that you have to take some liberties for the writing. But it is an entirely different thing for the compendium entries. These are presented as if they are accurate representations of the figure's source material, and people do take these seriously. Why are like half the goddesses in the game arbitrarily called mother goddesses? Why do they still say Gabriel's name is derived from Sumerian? Why, in the Japanese version of the game, is Skadi claimed to be the Celtic Day of Judgment? These are things you could correct with a basic Google search, even using their favorite source, Wikipedia. I could forgive stuff like this 20 years ago, but there's really no excuse for this now with the internet. It is so easy to find better sources. Like, does no one at Atlas fact check the old notes? Surely someone must know that there's been new research since 1992. If they do, you really can't tell. Now let's shift and talk about the graphics and performance. I'm going to preface this by saying the vast majority of my experience is based on the release version of the game, with no updates, so future updates may have improved the game to some degree. That said, I came across a few issues. I'm going to describe all the ones I remember offhand. The game is supposed to run at a locked 30 FPS, but it may as well be 20 because it dropped frames regularly. I found that every time I fused a demon, there was a texture pop in that took around 2 or 3 seconds to load. One time I was in Da'at, and when I looked into the distance, I saw a demon moving around, but its walking animation was like 5 frames per second. I had this one weird issue where what I'm assuming happened is the camera view during combat either went out of bounds or inside a character model by accident, which meant that for the entirety of an attack animation, all I saw was a blurred screen. I also had an issue where sometimes I would select a command in combat, but it wouldn't register for around 6 or 7 seconds, so I would just be kind of sitting there waiting for the game to load. And unlike the others that were easy to ignore or just funny, this just outright halted my gameplay experience. I think this is the worst crime a game like this can commit, because the way I see it, this game is pure fun factor and no substance, so it makes issues like that much worse. It's also just really stressful because it's like, did my game freeze? But all of that said, none of them besides the last one really hampered my gameplay that much, and that one happened like 3 times maybe. It's not exactly the sign of a quality product, but it's a turn-based game, and personally, I don't think it's a big deal as long as it doesn't affect the flow of combat. So to put this all together, I thought the gameplay had some questionable, but not outright bad choices, and its fun factor regularly overwhelms the gameplay negatives, though it definitely could have been more fine-tuned. The new mechanics this game adds are very useful, but I felt some of it was too strong, especially considering the sheer amount of freedom the player has with customization. I would recommend this game if you aren't really invested in Megaten or you just care about gameplay. For new players specifically, you should know that this game's writing is very reliant on previous games in the series, like SMT3 Nocturne or SMT1. This means you won't have any context to some terms, imagery, and why characters act in certain ways. Though honestly, without that context, you might have a better time, because you aren't invested. If you can, I would advise you to play Nocturne first at least, either the original or the recent HD remaster, but really, as a casual fan, it doesn't matter that much, since you can understand the plot without it. However, if you play SMT for the themes, or care about the writing in games in general, you are not going to get much out of SMT5. Certainly nothing that you can't find just better in titles like Nocturne or SMT1. Frankly, my experience with SMT5 was very disappointing. The writing is just overall terrible, the story is bloated, the background lore is sloppy, the endings don't make sense, and the characters are cardboard. I've been seeing people justify the bad writing by saying the writing was never the focus for SMT, and not only is this just factually wrong, but even if this was true, SMT5 is still easily among the worst. This game gives me the feeling that the devs were just going through the motions, and checking off a list of obligatory things an SMT game would do, rather than make an actual SMT game. And it's just really sad for me to see the quality of this series drop so low. Personally, SMT5 ranks among my least favorite titles in this series, right before SMT4 Apocalypse. If we were just talking about combat, this would be in my top 3 for sure, but that's not why I play SMT. Ultimately, I just cannot agree that the quality of the gameplay justifies the absolute lack of care.